My father was right to leave you a story of silence, truth, and the embrace that came too late. My father was right to leave you. You're despicable, Mom. I heard that from my daughter at that dinner table. Her smile was still on her face, along with her sarcasm. Little did my daughter know that those words spoken at that table would, within minutes, become her greatest regret. She had no idea who was about to ring the doorbell, that her smile would vanish along with that arrogance, and that everything she thought she knew was wrong. My name is Laura. I'm 65 years old. And it was on that night that I understood my own daughter had been carrying poison inside her for entire decades. A poison planted on a story she never truly knew because she never wanted to ask. And look, I know there are people listening to me right now. Write in the comments what city you're from. I want to know if there are others going through this like me, because sometimes you feel completely alone in these things, and you're not. That night didn't begin with cruelty, at least not on my side. I spent the entire afternoon preparing dinner with a care I didn't need to justify to anyone, but which was always my way of showing love without having to announce it. The roast chicken that Brenda had been asking for since she was little, seasoned with garlic, crushed with a knife, and freshly squeezed lemon. That smell that fills the whole house while it bakes, which for me tastes like a good memory. Fresh squeezed lemonade, made from scratch, because she has never been able to stand the store-bought kind since she was 10 years old. And I never forgot that. The table set with the white embroidered tablecloth my mother gave me as a wedding gift. The one I wash by hand, fold, and keep wrapped in a plastic bag in the wardrobe as if it were a relic. Because to me, it truly is. I got ready too. Not too much, nothing over the top. I put on light lipstick, combed my hair more carefully than on regular days, put on the blue blouse that Brenda once mentioned looked good on me, on some ordinary afternoon years ago. That thing mothers do when they dress up for their child's visit, you know? We do it without anyone asking, without even quite realizing we're doing it. She arrived with her husband, Raymond, a quiet and polite man who had always treated me with genuine warmth, the kind you can't confuse with circumstantial courtesy. He hugged me at the door with the embrace of someone who's truly happy to be there. Asked how I was while looking me in the eyes, not just for show. I like Raymond very much. From the first day Brenda brought him home, I sensed she had chosen someone who would treat her well. Brenda came in right behind him, gave me a kiss on the cheek, commented that the chicken smelled good, glanced around the living room. I noticed she was different at the door. Not in a bad way at first, but tense, like someone who walks into a space expecting to find something they can't yet name, but with their radar on. I had told her there would be a surprise. Just that, no details. And that's when something began to stir inside her. I saw it on her face as I handed out the glasses and fetched the lemonade from the fridge. I know my daughter. I've known every expression of hers since she was 4 years old. I can tell the difference between a real smile and a polite one. That smile at the door was polite, but I let it go because sometimes you do, because pushing doesn't help, and certain things have to come in their own time. I sat everyone down, served the lemonade, served the chicken, and the evening unfolded with that surface-level normalcy that sometimes precedes the big things. We sat at the table, the three of us. Raymond said grace in that calm voice of his, and I silently thanked myself for having such a son-in-law. The conversation was normal in the first few minutes, that beginning of dinner talk that fills the space while people are still settling in together. Raymond mentioned a trip they were planning to the coast. Brenda said something about work. I listened and responded, sipping the lemonade slowly. At one point, Brenda asked about the surprise, her impatience a little more apparent than before. "What is this surprise, Mom? Can you tell us now?" I smiled and said it was for later, that we'd eat first. She went back to her plate with the look of someone who accepted the answer but wasn't even slightly satisfied. I got up to fetch more rice from the kitchen, and when I came back, the two of them had stopped talking abruptly. I saw Raymond with the expression of someone caught mid-sentence. Brenda looked at me with a quick smile. I said nothing. I served the rice. I sat down. I knew she had been talking to him about the surprise, building some theory that wasn't right, and then Brenda raised her glass. Slowly, with the air of someone who has something important to say and wants everyone to pay attention before beginning. Raymond raised his too, automatically, smiling without any idea of what was coming. And I stayed with the spoon suspended over the rice, looking at her, waiting. "Before the surprise," she said, her eyes fixed on me, "I want to make a toast." She took one breath. It seemed more like preparation than need, and continued without blinking. "To my father, who was lucky. He left you at just the right time and must be living far away from you. If I knew where he was, I'd be with him right now. Not here." The silence that followed was the kind you hear with your entire body. Raymond set his glass down slowly. I didn't move anything. I just kept looking at my plate, at the chicken I had prepared with such care, at the spoon still suspended in my hand. My daughter had said that at my table, at my dinner, in front of the tablecloth my mother had given me. And she still wore that smile. Small, satisfied, like someone who finally said what she'd been holding back too long, as if she'd lifted a weight off her shoulders and now the evening could move forward normally, as if those were meaningless words. I didn't respond. Not because I had nothing to say. I had 35 years of things to say. But I knew that anything coming out of my mouth in that heat, in front of Raymond, would come from anger, not from truth. And she deserved the truth, not the anger. So I breathed, once, deep, slow, the way you learn when you spend years managing things you can't control. I set the spoon on the plate without making noise, wiped my mouth with the white napkin, stood up from the chair. "Excuse me for a moment," I said. The voice came out calmer than I expected. I went to the kitchen without looking back, and the last thing I heard before the kitchen door closed was Raymond calling her name in a low, serious tone. But I didn't stay to hear what he said next. In the kitchen, the only sound was the dripping faucet. Regular, constant. That drip I'd had for months without fixing, which in that forced silence was the most concrete thing I could hear. I took the glass on the counter, filled it with the leftover fresh squeezed lemonade from the pitcher. I drank slowly, staring at the white tiles. I stayed like that for 2-3 minutes, just breathing and listening to the drip. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just stood there putting myself back together before going back to the living room. And it was in that kitchen silence that the decision I had already made days before became absolutely firm inside me. I took my phone from the apron pocket. I opened the contact. I stared at the name for a few seconds that cost more than they seemed. Marcus. I dialed. He picked up on the second ring, like someone who was waiting. I said only what needed to be said. "You can come now. It's time." He said, "I'm already on my way." I hung up, put the phone back in my pocket, dried my hands on the apron, took one more breath, and went back to the living room. But for you to understand why that night weighed so heavily on me and why that phone call was the most important thing I'd done in 30 years, I need to go back in time. I need to tell you where all of this came from, because a story like this doesn't begin at a dinner table. It begins much earlier, in a place most people prefer not to look. I was 30 years old when my life began to fall apart slowly. Not all at once, not with a crash you hear and immediately know what it was. Gradually, like when a wall has a crack. First you ignore it, then you start to worry, and then one day you look and the crack has crossed the whole thing from side to side, and you wonder when you let it get that far. Marcus was my husband. Brenda was our 4-year-old daughter. And alcohol was the third resident of our home, the one who, in practice, ruled over the other two. I married him believing he was a good man, and for a time he was. He had that wide smile that took over his whole face, that laughter that filled the room and invited anyone nearby to join in, that way of showing up with flowers on no special occasion just because he felt like it. At first, I laughed it off when he drank a little too much at weekend parties. I thought it was just what young men did, that it would pass with maturity, with adult life settling in. But it didn't pass. It grew, like a shadow that advances as the sun sets, so slowly you don't notice until you're completely covered by it. And when the shadow arrived completely, it didn't come alone. It came with loud voices in the middle of the night, with words that cut in a way no knife cuts, with a change in his gaze that I learned to recognize even before he opened his mouth, before he even came close to me. When he was sober, you could still recognize the man I had married. The eyes were the same. The smile appeared now and then. There were moments when he held Brenda on his lap and played with her in a way that made me believe that could be the normal again. But when the alcohol arrived, that man vanished completely. In his place was another, one who broke whatever was in his path, who used words I won't repeat here because some of them still hurt when they surface in memory, even after so much time. I tried everything. I tried talking when he was sober, tried with affection, tried with anger, tried with tears, tried with silence. I tried talking to his family, to his mother, who lived across town, and who received my calls with a weariness that told me this was nothing new to her. I tried believing it would get better when he found a better job, when we had more money, when the stress decreased. The stress never decreased. The money never flowed easy, and the drinking never stopped. There were nights when I'd put Brenda to bed and sit at the edge of her mattress until she fell asleep, listening to the sounds from the living room, calculating by the tone of the noises how much that night was going to cost. I learned to read the weight of his footsteps, the way he opened and closed the fridge, the way he pulled out a chair. You learn these things when you need to, when survival depends on being able to anticipate. Brenda grew up in that environment without the vocabulary to name what it was, but with her body absorbing everything. Children absorb more than we imagine. They don't understand the words, but they understand the atmosphere. They understand the tension in the air. They understand when their mother's shoulders are different, when her voice changes tone, when they need to stay very quiet without anyone asking. And one day, his hand reached Brenda. I was in the kitchen when it happened. Brenda was 4 years old, in the hallway playing with that cloth doll she carried everywhere, a cloth doll with yellow yarn hair that I had sewn myself on a Sunday afternoon. I heard the sound of the front door, recognized the way it opened, that way of someone not controlling the force of their own hands, and felt that specific cold in my stomach you feel when you anticipate what's coming. Brenda ran to hug him. The way children do, with total trust, without any fear, still not having learned that on certain nights the father who arrived wasn't the same as the one from the morning. She ran with the yarn doll in her hand, and I heard her crying from the kitchen before I could understand exactly what had happened, before I could get to the hallway. I ran. Brenda was on the floor, her knee hurt, looking at her father with that expression children have when they don't understand what happened, but know it was wrong, know that shouldn't have happened. The cloth doll had been left about a meter behind her, tossed on the hallway floor. And Marcus was leaning against the wall with that vacant look of someone who was beyond any reach at that moment. Something consolidated inside me in that instant. It wasn't an explosion. It wasn't hysteria. It was an icy clarity, the kind that comes when you completely stop deceiving yourself. When you look at the situation without the veil, you yourself had been weaving for months so as not to see what was always there. I picked Brenda up, took her to the bedroom, tended to her knee with care, put her to sleep making up a fairy tale on the spot, pretending my voice was normal when it was nowhere near that. And when she fell asleep, with that child's breathing of someone who trusts her mother even when everything around is wrong, I went to the living room. Marcus was on the sofa with his eyes nearly closed, his head tilting slightly forward. I stood before him, with trembling hands that I kept still with all the force I had, and said the words I had rehearsed without knowing I was rehearsing. Either you quit drinking, or I throw you out of this house. He looked at me for a few seconds I can't measure, with that clouded gaze that wasn't really reaching me. Then he got up without a word, went to the bedroom, closed the door. The next morning when I woke up, His drawer was open and empty. The handful of shirts he kept there had disappeared. No note, no phone call, no word. Marcus had left during the night like someone fleeing a fire, not like someone making an adult choice. And I was left there, with Brenda, 4 years old, asleep in her room, with the open drawer, with that mixture of relief and pain that took me years to name properly. Relief because the threat had gone, and pain because along with it went the man I had loved before the alcohol took his place, and the possibility that things could ever be different. The first weeks after he left had that strangeness of silence that feels like noise at first. The house became large in a way I hadn't expected, not because he was large, but because absence fills space in a way presence doesn't. You stop calculating the sounds of arrival, stop monitoring the smell of the hallway, stop sleeping with your shoulders raised. And that stopping, which should be pure relief, comes with a strange disorientation, because you were so used to being afraid that your body doesn't know what to do when the fear disappears. I woke up that first Saturday of that new life, looked around, and decided to reorganize the wardrobe. There was no special reason. I needed to do something with my hands, needed the day to move forward regardless of what I was feeling. Brenda woke up later, came to me in the kitchen with her hair messy, asked where the bread was. I said it was on the second shelf. She got it, went back to the living room. That day went on, and the days that followed went on too, and that's how the new life began. Not with any declaration, but with the bread on the second shelf and the days one after another. From that day on, I was both things at once, mother and father. I was whatever she needed me to be, on the day she needed it, in the way she needed it. I worked enough so that she wouldn't lack for anything that mattered, even if that meant I came second in many things. I spent sleepless nights helping with school projects, learned to fix faucets, learned to assemble flat-pack furniture following those illustrated instructions that make no sense until you get the second piece wrong. I learned to say I was fine when I wasn't. I learned not to let my exhaustion spill out in front of her, because she shouldn't have to pay the price of her mother's tiredness. I learned to smile at the school gate while she walked in, then cry in the car before putting it in gear. It wasn't easy, but I didn't allow myself to sink, because she couldn't pay the price of that. Brenda grew up with no clear memory of her father. 4 years old is too young to keep faces with clarity, but old enough to hold on to absences. And it was this absence that shaped her over time, first as a question she asked with her little child's eyes in the morning, at breakfast every now and then. "Mom, where does my dad live?" Then as a quiet resentment of a girl I'd see on her face when there were school presentations, and she'd look to the side and see other kids' parents. And finally, as an accusation she had built on her own, with the pieces of the story she gathered in silence, without ever bringing them to me to confirm or correct. She never asked me. That's the detail that weighed on me most over time. She never came to ask me what had happened, why her father had left, what I had done or not done. She simply decided on her own, and assigned blame according to her own logic, the logic of a child without a father who needed an explanation that fit in her heart. And the explanation that fit was that it was my fault. I started noticing this when she was around 12, 13. A sharpness that arrived gradually, a distance that grew, that way of looking at me that seemed more like judgment than affection. I tried to talk several times. She always deflected, said she was fine, that it was nothing, and went back to her room with a book or headphones. Over time, I learned to live with that coldness, like a chronic condition. You don't cure it, you learn to live with it. I loved my daughter with the same intensity as always, and she tolerated me with a courtesy that sometimes hurt more than any open argument would have. Because arguments you process. That polite coldness had nowhere to land. There was one afternoon, when Brenda was around 16, that stayed with me in a way it never left. I had come home from work earlier than usual, went straight to the kitchen to get a head start on dinner. She was in the living room with a school friend, the two of them talking on the sofa. I overheard, without meaning to, the friend asking whether Brenda's father came around much. and Brenda answered without hesitating. My dad doesn't live here because my mom didn't let him. I stopped in the hallway. The knife I was holding stayed suspended in the air for a few seconds. Then I kept walking to the kitchen without saying anything, because the friend was there and it wasn't the moment, and because part of me was too paralyzed to react. That night, after the friend left, I tried to talk to her. I said I wanted to explain how things had really happened, that she deserved to know. She looked at me with that closed expression of a teenager who has already made up her mind and doesn't want anyone touching it, and said she was tired and going to sleep. I was left alone in the living room with dinner on the table, feeling that sensation I had learned to recognize over the years, being completely alone inside my own home, in my daughter's company. The years went by. Brenda grew up, left for college, then came the job, then Raymond, marriage, adult life assembling itself. And I grew more peripheral in that life, that presence that shows up for Sunday lunch when invited, that fills the space without taking up much. The mother who is there, necessary in certain practical situations, but not consulted on the decisions that matter. There were moments when I'd catch myself looking at my phone, waiting for a call that never came. Not in a dramatic way, not with soap opera anguish. It was a quiet thing, that low-level waiting you don't even call waiting because that would mean admitting you were waiting. I'd keep my phone on the dinner table while I ate alone, and every now and then glance at it, then go back to my plate. When Raymond and Brenda got married, she invited me to help choose the dress. I went, of course. We visited 3 stores on a Saturday afternoon. She tried on several styles. I gave my opinion when she asked. I held her bag while she twirled in front of the mirror. It was a good afternoon, but at no point that afternoon did I feel essential. I felt invited, which is different. Perhaps Constance was right when she said I never needed to be anything more than invited because I never asked for anything else. Perhaps I had learned to fit into a smaller space than the one that was rightfully mine, and over time had confused that smaller size with the actual size of things. It wasn't that Brenda was wicked. That wasn't it. She wasn't a villain, not cruel by nature. She was a woman who had built herself on a false belief, and over time had hardened inside that belief because she had never had the chance to question it. And I wondered many times, in the silences of my home, whether I also carried some responsibility for this. Whether I should have forced that conversation when she was younger, told her the whole story even if she didn't want to hear. Had I been evasive too? Had I waited for her to come and ask when I should have been the one to go to her? These questions have no right answers. They remain. But it was on one particular afternoon that Brenda's behavior became clearer to me than it ever had before. About 3 weeks before the dinner I'm telling you about, I was at the home of a longtime friend, Constance, a woman who has known me for more than 30 years and knows my story inside and out. Constance had invited me for lunch, something simple, just the 2 of us, her wonderful cooking, and that long afternoon conversation that stretches on because when 2 women of that friendship get together, time slips by without warning. At one point I mentioned Brenda, not in a way where I was complaining, but in a way that just came out, that unburdening that comes when you're in a safe place with someone who knows you. I told her about some things that had happened in recent weeks, one specific situation that had hurt me. I had called Brenda one Wednesday afternoon to let her know I was nearby and asked if I could pop up for a moment. She said it wasn't a good time, that she had people over. That was fine, I understood. I asked if I could come by another day that week. She said she'd see and would send me a message. The message never came that week, or the next. I didn't push. Constance listened to me with that expression she has when she's genuinely processing something, and then said something that echoed in me for days afterward. Laura, do you realize you've been adjusting to her for decades without her ever needing to adjust to you in any way? And she continued, you never knock on her door uninvited. You don't follow up on the message that never came. You don't tell her when you're hurt. She has never needed to treat you with care because you never let anything fall short in any other way. I stared at Constance's plate without saying anything for a while. Not because I didn't have an answer, but because the answer I had wasn't easy to swallow. She wasn't wrong. And I wondered in that moment how many people go through this in silence. How many mothers adjust, give in, shrink inside their own relationship with their children and never say a word, because love doesn't allow it, because the fear of losing what little they have doesn't allow it, because the shame of admitting that your daughter treats you like a supporting character doesn't allow it. I went home that afternoon, carrying what Constance had said in a different way than I usually carried things. Carrying it as a question, not as guilt, wondering what I was going to do with it. And it was around that time that Marcus appeared. On an ordinary Saturday morning, I was in the kitchen making coffee, in my nightgown, hair loose, with no plan to receive anyone. I opened the door without even asking who it was, in that careless way of someone who has lived alone for many years and got used to silence and the absence of surprises. It was Marcus. I was so startled I almost closed the door in his face. Not from anger, not in that moment, from the pure shock of seeing that face after so many years. There he was, 35 years later, at my door, carrying the weight of all of it in his body and face. And something else I recognized immediately: guilt. That guilt that has no disguise when it's ripe, when it's been carried too long without being resolved. He looked different. Of course he did. We both did. White hair at the temples, shoulders slightly curved, those lines time draws on the face without asking permission. But there was something in his eyes I had never seen when we were married. A sobriety from within, not just the sobriety of someone who stopped drinking. We stayed like that for a moment at the door, him looking at me looking at him, without any words occupying the space between us. And then he said, in a voice so quiet it sounded like a request before any words, "May I come in, Laura?" I let him in. I still don't know exactly why I made that decision so quickly. Maybe because I didn't think, I just moved. Or maybe because some part of me knew that this encounter needed to happen, that there was something there I couldn't close the door on before hearing. We sat in the living room. I didn't offer coffee, didn't make that automatic gesture of hospitality you make when you receive someone. I sat on the sofa with my hands in my lap, looking at him, waiting, without making the conversation easier, because it wasn't my responsibility to start it. He was direct. He said he had come to find me because he couldn't keep carrying what he was carrying. That he had left the drinking behind many years ago, that he had rebuilt his life, that he had gone through things that transformed him in ways he couldn't explain precisely. But that this piece, the piece that involved me and Brenda, he couldn't leave behind without speaking to me in person. And then he knelt down. I truly did not expect that. This man who had humiliated me within our home, who had raised his hand against my 4-year-old daughter, was on his knees in my living room with his chin slightly trembling, asking for forgiveness with words he had chosen one by one, as someone choosing each brick of a confession. He said he knew words undo nothing of what was done. He said what he had done was cowardly. That when I gave the ultimatum, he had no strength to change, and that he fled because it was easier than facing the size of the problem he was. That he had abandoned us not because I pushed him away, but because he chose cowardice over everything else. I listened to everything, with eyes that welled up without permission, without any order I had given them. I didn't cry, but kept that moisture the whole time, looking at him down there in that position no pride survives for long. When he finished, I stayed silent for a while. I let the silence occupy the space it needed to, which was a lot. And then I said the most truthful thing I knew to say in that moment. I hated you for many years, Marcus. In a deep way, the kind that even frightened me. But I found something that taught me to let that go. I didn't do it for you. I did it for myself. And today, I am at peace. He looked at me with a look I wouldn't know how to describe precisely if I tried. Then he said simply, "Thank you." One word, with the weight of much more than one. I then spoke of Brenda. I said our daughter was well, that she had married a good man, but that she carried a wound from the abandonment that she had never let properly heal, that she had become a woman who was hard in a way that sometimes worried me. That part of that, I believed with complete certainty, came from his absence, from the void she had never managed to process. I also said that Brenda had a version of the story that wasn't the real one. That she had spent decades believing he left because I had expelled him, not because he had chosen alcohol over his family. That she held me accountable, in ways sometimes subtle and sometimes not, for a guilt that wasn't mine. Marcus listened to this with his head lowered and his hands clasped in his lap, each word landing on him with a weight I could see in the shoulder that kept curving. And that's when the idea came. I don't know where it came from, whether it was calculated thinking or a mother's intuition, but it left me with a clarity that surprised me. I proposed that he come to a dinner, that I would invite Brenda by telling her there would be a surprise and that he would show up, that it was time for her to hear the story from the mouth of the man who had lived it from the inside. I'm not quite sure why I proposed that in that moment, whether I was guided by something larger than reason, or whether it was simply the logical conclusion of everything I'd been thinking in the weeks before. But I know that in the moment I proposed it, I knew it was right. We set the day, the time. He left. And I stayed there in the living room after the door closed, alone with the silence and that strange feeling of someone who has just opened a window that had been shut for a long time, not yet knowing whether the air coming in would be good or whether it would bring more cold. In the days leading up to the dinner, life continued as it always had. I went to the market, tidied the house, watered the plants on the balcony, my most faithful companions over many years. I have a fern that has survived 3 moves with me, and which I care for with more tenderness than I tell anyone. There's a way its fronds droop when it needs water that I learned to recognize from a distance, and that has given me more satisfaction than it probably should. But going back to that period before the dinner, I caught myself more than once thinking that Arthur would have liked to know what I was doing. He always said I was braver than I gave myself credit for. I called Brenda, invited her to dinner, said I had a surprise. She accepted with that politeness of hers, that surface courtesy I had learned to recognize over the years. "Of course, Mom. What time?" Without asking anything else, without showing curiosity beyond the basic. But I noticed on that short phone call that she was already building something in her head. I know my daughter. That second of silence before the "of course" wasn't thinking time. It was time to swallow something she had already started deciding. And what she had decided, I would understand that night, was that I was seeing another man and had called her to introduce him. It was the only interpretation her mind could assemble with the few clues I'd given. And that interpretation had grown in the days before the dinner until it became a certainty inside her. A certainty that, I later learned from Raymond, she had turned into bitter comments at home in the days before. "My mom wants to introduce me to some man. She wants approval she's not going to get." On the day of the dinner, while I was roasting the chicken and setting the table, Marcus sent me a message asking if we were still on. I replied yes. He replied with just, "I'm nervous," and I, without much thought, wrote back, "Me too." Because I was. There was that chill in my stomach of someone who knows the night is going to be significant one way or another. It would either lead to understanding or to catastrophe. But it wasn't going to pass without meaning something. That much I knew. Now you already know what happened at that table. You know what Brenda said. You know I went to the kitchen. You know I made the call. What you don't yet know is what happened after. I went back to the living room with a steady step, sat back in my place, served myself a little more rice as if I had only stepped away for a drink of water and nothing more. Raymond looked at me with a gaze full of things he didn't know how to say. Brenda looked at me with an expression that was a strange mix of provocation and something that almost seemed like regret, but that she wasn't ready to let show on her face yet. I ate, slowly, unhurriedly, without looking at her with any accusation, because I didn't need to accuse. I knew what was coming. The conversation was minimal in the minutes that followed. Raymond tried to say something about how good the food was. I responded briefly. Brenda kept staring at her glass with the expression of someone wrestling with a thought they don't want to release, but don't quite know what to do with. 10 minutes maybe 15. Time feels different when you're waiting for something you know is coming, but don't know exactly how it will arrive. And then there was a knock at the door. Brenda got up before me, which was what I expected her to do. She went to the door, pulled the handle, and stopped completely mid-gesture, as if her body had frozen before her mind could process what it was seeing. I was about 3 steps behind her, watching from the side. I saw her shoulders go rigid all at once, that stiffening you recognize from a distance when you've known someone since they were small. I saw her hand on the handle tighten until her knuckles changed color, and I heard, in a tone that carried decades of absence inside a single word, her say, "Dad?" Marcus was in the doorway with that face I had seen weeks before, the face of someone who comes carrying the weight of a life and of guilt together, no longer pretending that doesn't exist. He said her name with a voice that trembled on a frequency you feel before you hear. Brenda. She stayed motionless for a few seconds that couldn't be measured by any clock, and then she turned her face slowly toward me, searching for something in my eyes. Maybe explanation, maybe permission, maybe just confirmation that this was real and not some trap she didn't yet understand. I said only, "Come in, Marcus," in a voice I had to genuinely control to come out in exactly the tone I wanted, without anger, without triumph, without anything that shouldn't be there. He came in. Raymond stood behind his own chair, not knowing quite where to place himself in a moment where everything was reorganizing around him. And the 4 of us ended up seated back at the table, but with a completely different air than before, with something in the room that had no name, but that all 4 of us felt the same way. Marcus didn't dance around it. He looked directly at Brenda and said she had every right not to want to hear him, but that he needed her to know the truth. He said that word, truth, with a weight that showed he knew exactly what he was saying. And he began to speak. He told the story of the drinking without softening anything, without those gentle touches people use when confessing, but still holding something back for themselves. He told of the nights he came home in a state he himself described with shame, his face slightly flushed as he spoke, his eyes fixed on his daughter. He told of the things he broke inside our home, the words he used, the way he treated the woman who was trying to hold everything together while he sank. Brenda was completely still. He told of the day he came home drunk, and she, 4 years old, ran to meet him in the hallway with the cloth doll in her hand. He said the words without softening, that she had fallen, that I had heard the crying from the kitchen, that he was too drunk to care in the moment that mattered most. Brenda's face changed as she listened. Not all at once. Gradually, the way a belief gets dismantled piece by piece and you lose the ground beneath your feet. She was hearing her own story told from an angle she had never considered, by the very man she had romanticized her whole life without ever truly knowing him. He told of the ultimatum I gave. He said exactly how it had been, that I looked him in the eyes and said either he quit drinking or he had to leave. He said that in that moment he knew he was incapable of quitting the drinking, that it had more power over him than any love he could swear he felt, and that the choice he made was the coward's choice, to flee instead of fight, to disappear instead of face what he was. He said the abandonment was his cowardice, not my decision, not an expulsion, a flight. Brenda didn't say a word throughout all of this. She sat with her hands in her lap, looking sometimes at her father, sometimes at the table, sometimes at a point in the air that was nothing, just the void of someone having a certainty undone in real time. Marcus also spoke of me. He said I had raised Brenda alone with everything I had, that I had worked, that I had kept the house standing, that I had done everything for her while he was far away pretending he didn't have a daughter. He said I was the only person in that story who had never abandoned anyone. Not once. When he finished, the room fell silent. A silence different from all the others that had been there that night. The silence of the toast had been heavy with constructed cruelty. This one was heavy with understanding that arrived too late. Both hurt, but in completely different ways. I looked at Brenda. She was looking at her lap with her hands still on the table, and I saw, running down her face slowly, a tear. Just one, at first. She made no movement to wipe it, as if she hadn't even noticed she was crying, as if the tears were coming from a place deeper than where you can feel things clearly. Raymond placed his hand over hers. She didn't look at him. She stayed looking at her lap for a few more seconds that weighed heavily in the room's silence. Then she raised her face slowly and looked at me. And I saw in that look everything she had never said, every question she had never asked, every hurt she had poured onto me for years without understanding she was pouring it onto the wrong person. I saw all of it together in a single gaze, in 1 second that lasted much longer than a second. "Mom," she said. Her voice broke. That way of someone trying to speak while crying doesn't let the voice stay whole. She got up slowly, came to where I was sitting, and held me. With a force that genuinely surprised me. That force you don't expect from arms that had given you short, contained hugs for years. Those arms held me in a way I didn't recognize, as if she were trying to recover with her own hands something she herself had wasted. "I'm sorry, Mom. I'm so sorry." I closed my eyes. I held her. And we stayed like that for a time I can't measure in minutes, because when you're inside a moment like that, time stops working the normal way. After Marcus left that night, the house settled into a silence with a different texture than the silence before the dinner. Brenda and Raymond stayed a while longer, sitting on the sofa, and the conversation that came was the kind that follows great revelations, low in volume, short in sentences, with silences no one tried to fill. Brenda gazed at the photos on the wall for a while. There's one of me and her when she was around 6, in front of the school on the first day. Her with her new backpack, me with my hair up, that August morning light bursting through the image. She stayed a long time looking at that photo specifically, without saying anything, with an expression I couldn't quite name, but that stayed with me afterward. At one point she said, almost quietly, that she had never noticed how tired my expression was in that photo. "You're smiling, but you look exhausted, Mom." I said I was, that time had been hard, that I worked mornings and afternoons and sometimes evenings, too. She stared at the floor after that, quiet. Before leaving, she took my hand. She said she wanted to talk more, that there were many things she still needed to understand, many things she needed to revisit, many things she owed me that she didn't know how to begin to return. I said I'd be here, that I always had been. She left. I closed the door. I went to the kitchen, washed the dinner dishes slowly, let the warm water run over my hands longer than needed. It's the kind of thing you do when you need a moment of normalcy after something big. You wash up, you dry, you put things back on the shelf, and your body slowly returns to the ground it was on before. I folded my mother's embroidered tablecloth with care, put it back in the plastic bag in the wardrobe, turned off the living room lights one by one, sat for a moment in the kitchen chair in the silence, with the sound of the dripping faucet still there, constant as always. That drip I fixed the following week. I won't tell you everything was resolved that night. It wasn't, and it would be dishonest of me to say it was. Brenda apologized, and I believe it was real. I believe it came from deep inside her. But an apology doesn't erase years. It doesn't undo the toast. It doesn't undo the birthday lunch. It doesn't undo the short hugs. It doesn't undo the 2-minute phone calls. It doesn't undo the years of cold courtesy that stung my skin like real cold. In the months that followed, things changed little by little. Not suddenly, not in a dramatic turn. Gradually, the way things truly change when they change from the inside out. Brenda started calling more. Not much more, but more. Sometimes with no particular reason, just to check in. Sometimes she'd come by for coffee without needing a week's notice. One afternoon she arrived with a small plant she'd bought at a market. She said it reminded her of me when she saw it, because I like plants. She stayed about 20 minutes, helped me choose where to put it in the apartment, left in a hurry because she had somewhere to be. But she stayed those 20 minutes, and the plant stayed on the kitchen windowsill where it still is today. These small things are what rebuild what was broken. Not the grand gestures, not the long conversations. The small things that say, "I'm thinking of you," without anyone needing to use those words. I don't know the future. I don't know how this story ends because it's still being written, and I prefer it that way. I prefer not to know the ending of a story while I'm still inside it. What I know is what remained. What remained was that embrace. Those arms around me with a force I hadn't recognized since she was a little girl. This thing where children grow up and the hugs get shorter, more contained, more careful, and you accept that as part of what it is, as an adult thing, as life moving on. But when that adult woman, my daughter, held me that way that night, I remembered the 4-year-old girl I used to pick up after her father arrived drunk, who would fall asleep pressed into my neck with that child's breathing of someone who has no more problems because her mother is there. Because her mother was always there, and I am well. Not in the sense that everything passed without leaving a mark, in the sense that I know who I am. I know what I did and what I didn't do. I know I raised my daughter with everything I had, alone, without help from anyone but myself, and that throughout all those years when she looked at me with distance and resentment, I never stopped loving her. Not for one single day. Nothing can take that from me. Not the toast, not the years, not anything anyone might say at a dinner table. If this story touched you, if it moved you in some way, share it. Because there are many mothers out there silently carrying a story that was never told right to the one who needed to hear it. And there are many children who assumed without asking, who built a version and never went to check whether it was true. Before you condemn someone, ask, because the person you're blaming might be the only one who never abandoned you. If you'd like to hear other moving stories like this one, click on one appearing on your screen now. Click on one and keep being moved with us.